Hello, this is Michael Steinman from Jazz Lives. I have the immense privilege of sitting in the 25th floor suite of the Hotel Beacon with Bob Wilber, and off to our right is his wife, Pug Horton, who is usually singing but is now making dinner. And we're going to talk a little bit about my theory, or my subject, which is musicians that Bob might have had some contact with who deserve to be better known. And the rules of the game, I told Bob, is if he has nothing to say, he gets to say, I have nothing to say, and we move on. And there are no penalty points deducted. So, are you ready to play?
Ready to play.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mentioned to you the first one I was thinking of is the clarinetist Buster Bailey.
Yeah.
Did you ever cross paths with him?
Yeah, I knew Buster not well, but we often were musicians that are on some of the freelance jazz concerts where everybody was hired individually back in my younger days. And of course I knew his playing. First of all, I think with the small group that he was with in the 30s.
John Kirby's
Group, yeah. Although maybe I also heard earlier recordings with Fletcher Henderson, But he was one of the great clarinetists from that era of jazz, the early era. And he was well liked by musicians. He was a very nice fellow.
Oh, great. That's always nice to know.
Yeah.
Did you ever cross paths with somebody even more obscure, a fellow named Jimmy Lytell?
The name is very familiar, and I've seen his name on old record labels from the 30s period, probably. Never ran into him.
Okay. Or Cecil Scott?
Cecil Scott, yeah, I knew Cecil Scott. I think I met him when he was maybe working at Jimmy Ryan's with, perhaps with Art Hodes. And I was very young, maybe I was still in high school, but he was a nice fellow, very friendly and interested in me as a young musician playing the clarinet, That's about all I can say about it.
And moving to another horn, did you ever encounter Don Byas?
I was a great admirer of Don Byas when I was starting to learn about jazz, and I was very fortunate growing up in a community where there was a small group of very dedicated fans of jazz. They were all in, say, if I was in the 7th grade, they would have been in the 9th grade or the 10th grade. And some of them that I had met had graduated and maybe drafted in the Army, because this was during the Korean War. But they all had extensive collections of recordings, so they were all, I knew that they had a group of them that played, and that they were always looking for a place to have a session. My father was a marvelous amateur piano player all his life, but he had a really beautiful Steinway Grand that he kept tuned, and because first thing he would do coming home from a day at the office would be to sit down at the piano and play. He just loved to play. And so I telephoned one of the guys and I said, "This is Bob Wilber. I'm a young clarinet player, and I know you guys are always looking for a place to jam, And my father said it would be fine if you wanted to use our living room, where I have a beautiful Steinway piano, say on a Sunday afternoon or something." Anyway, they were delighted, and so they came, and they were setting up and starting to play in the living room. And I'm up on the 3rd floor. I'm putting my clarinet together and wetting the reed and testing it. And I don't know what I was thinking of, but they were playing a familiar tune, and so I started down the staircase from the 3rd floor to the 2nd floor down into the living room playing. I can't remember what it was, but they heard me play, and suddenly I became a member of the group,
That's lovely. What a nice initiation story.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, let's go back to that a little bit. One of the people you played with in Scarsdale is still with us, I believe. That's the trombonist Eddie Hubble.
Eddie Hubble, yeah, sure. He was one of our original group. In fact, when I got the offer to do a recording for Commodore, I was immediately going to have him, the trombone player, on the recording. And he had left town with one of the big bands, and he wasn't available, so we did the record with just trumpet and clarinet front line.
Okay.
And the trumpet player, by the way, was John Glazell, who later on he went to Yale and was a fine trumpet player. I mean, he made those original records on Commodore. Later on, he got into union politics and spent a number of years being the president of Local 802.
Yeah. Speaking of trumpet players, one of my heroes is Johnny Windhurst.
Oh, yeah, sure.
What do you remember about him?
Well, when we were kids in Scarsdale, were playing, and we knew about John because he was a little older than us, and we knew him because he was known to go down to Nick's in the village and sit in with the band. So, and we were always very impressed with his playing. And so, when we started to have jam session, we invited him to play, and he was wonderful. He was definitely influenced maybe by Beiderbecke more than anybody else, but he was a very fine player.
If I remember correctly, he didn't read and he didn't want to read. I think that's the story I heard.
Yeah, it could be true, yeah.
Yeah. He and Hubble at some point were working with Red Mackenzie even.
Yeah.
Did you ever cross paths with Mackenzie?
Yeah, I did, yeah. I didn't know him well, but I did I think maybe played on sessions that he was on.
Wow.
Singing, yeah. Yeah.
I want to move to people who are a little bit closer to you. At one point in your life, you said you had a band in Boston with Joe Thomas on trumpet.
Well, he was never a regular trumpet player with my band. The band that I first had when I was playing at the Savoy on Mass Avenue was...
Was it Sidney the DeParis brothers?
No, I think it was Henry Goodwin, wasn't it, honey?
Jimmy Archie and Henry Goodwin.
Yeah, Jimmy Archie and Henry Goodwin on trombone and trumpet. No, I later worked on with the DeParis brothers when I opened George Wean's first nightclub, which was Storyville in Boston, and he asked me to form the band. I'd already been playing at the Savoy for 3 or 4 years and had quite a good name with the traditional jazz fans, particularly the college kids that were going to school in the Boston area. So I wanted to get this band together, and George said, well, just get together an all-star band with your favorite musicians. The first person I called was a drummer named Sidney Catlett, who I had met when I was invited to go to Nice with Mesro's band, because he was supposed to have had Sidney Bechet, and Sidney was involved in a club in Chicago. I think it was Jazz Limited, and he couldn't come, and so when Mesro called him, he said, "Oh, I'm tied up in this club, and they won't let me off even for a week, you know." And so Miz says, "Oh, Bechet, you're the star of the band. It's terrible." He says, "No, just take Bobby in my place." That was Bobby, who had been living with Sidney and studying with him for a number of years. So that's when I went to Nice, and then I got to know Sidney quite well. And one day I got a call when I was still living in a home in Scarsdale Mesro, and he says, "Hey, Bob, Mez here. Bechet's opening a school of music at his home in Brooklyn." And he said, I know you'd like to know about it. I said, oh, that's wonderful, Mez. Could you arrange an appointment for me to go to his house and I'd like to study with him if he would, but he'd have to hear me play. It turned out that I was his first student, and then I had moved to the Greenwich Village and was going out once a week. And then he said, why don't you come down here and stay with me and his wife at the time, Laura, here in Brooklyn. And so I said, oh, that would be wonderful. He says, we can have a lesson every day,
That's great.
So that was my introduction to the great Sidney Bechet, who was, of course, the greatest master of the soprano saxophone I've ever heard. He wasn't originally a soprano player, he was a clarinet player. In fact, the story was that he was playing in London, I think it's 1919, and he went by this music store and saw this strange looking, kind of like a metal clarinet, but it wasn't a clarinet, it was maybe, I didn't know what it was. He went into the store and said, what is that instrument in the window there that, it looks like a clarinet, but it's not a clarinet, it's some kind of, maybe a saxophone? There had apparently been no soprano saxophones around New Orleans when he was growing up there as a clarinet player. So that was the first time he went in the store and he played it, and he suddenly found a new voice. Of course, he always played the clarinet the rest of his life and was a marvelous clarinetist, but he became known really for the soprano sax.
And for the straight soprano sax.
The straight one, yeah. He said, I said, how about the curved soprano? He says, yeah, well, somebody bought me one in with me when I was playing in Chicago, and he says, I didn't like it. I tried to play it and I didn't like it. But he loved that straight soprano.
Okay. We'll take a break here for a second.
Okay.